The Galactic Council's Department of Xenobiology had always prided itself on precision. Their Deathworld classification system, developed over millennia of cataloging hostile environments across the galaxy, was considered the definitive measure of planetary lethality. The scale ranged from Class 1, mildly hazardous, to Class 12, absolute annihilation guaranteed. Most sapient species evolved on worlds classified between 2 and 4. The hardy Krillian warriors came from a Class 5 world. The legendary Faxon survival specialists originated from a brutal Class 6 environment. Then came Earth, and everything the galaxy thought it knew about survival was turned upside down. When the first xenobiological survey team reached the Sol system in 2387, their instruments nearly malfunctioned from the readings they were getting. Earth registered as a Class 11 Deathworld, a rating so severe that most council members assumed it was an error in their equipment. Class 11 worlds were supposed to be barren hellscapes where even mechanized exploration drones had difficulty surviving more than a few standard cycles. Yet here was a planet teeming with life, and not just simple organisms clinging to existence in deep-sea thermal vents or underground caves. This world hosted complex ecosystems, massive predators, and most impossibly of all, a thriving sapient species that called themselves humans. The initial report caused such disbelief in the Galactic Council chambers that 3 separate survey teams were dispatched to verify the findings. Each team returned with the same impossible data. Earth's gravity was nearly double the galactic standard. Its atmosphere contained dangerous levels of oxygen, a highly reactive gas that most species considered mildly toxic in small doses, and potentially explosive in the concentrations found on Earth. The planet's weather systems generated massive storms that could level entire cities, and its tectonic plates shifted with such violence that earthquakes were a regular occurrence. But the real shock came when they catalogued Earth's biosphere. The planet was essentially one massive arms race between predator and prey, where every organism seemed designed to kill or avoid being killed. The survey teams documented creatures like the great white shark, a perfect killing machine that had remained virtually unchanged for millions of years because it was already perfectly evolved for destruction. They found spiders whose venom could dissolve tissue from the inside out, plants that could kill with a touch, and microorganisms that could devastate entire populations. The humans, however, were not at the top of this food chain through superior claws or fangs or natural armor. They had conquered their world through something far more dangerous. Adaptability coupled with an almost pathological refusal to accept defeat. Dr. Verd, Zexa Hai, the Ultrurian xenobiologist who led the third survey mission, would later write in her report, "The humans do not merely survive on their death world, they thrive on it. More disturbing still, they seem to actively seek out its most dangerous aspects for recreation. We observed humans deliberately jumping from great heights with only fabric to slow their fall, swimming with the apex predators of their oceans, and climbing the most treacherous peaks of their world for no apparent reason other than personal satisfaction. The galaxy found this amusing at first. These humans were clearly an aberration, a species that had somehow lucked into sentience despite their world's hostility. They were tough, certainly, but toughness alone didn't make for galactic significance. The Council granted them the standard newcomer status and expected them to find their place among the lesser member species, perhaps as manual laborers or security personnel for worlds that found their current staff insufficiently robust. The laughter began when humanity requested to establish colonies on worlds that other species had abandoned as uninhabitable. The hegemony of Vorth had spent decades trying to extract resources from Kepler, 442c, a world with crushing gravity and atmospheric storms that could strip paint from reinforced buildings. They had finally given up when their 5th mining installation was destroyed by what their meteorologists insisted was impossible weather. The humans not only established a successful colony there within 2 years, but turned it into a vacation resort. When the Crystalline Collective retreated from the tidally locked world of Proxima Centauri, B, declaring the radiation levels and extreme temperature variations incompatible with meaningful existence, humans moved in and built thriving cities on both the day and night sides, connected by transportation tunnels that ran through the Terminator Zone. The ethereal consciousness had attempted to terraform 3 different worlds in the Goldilocks zone of various systems, spending enormous resources trying to create perfect environments for expansion. Each project was abandoned when minor complications arose: a slightly higher than optimal gravity, trace amounts of hydrogen sulfide in the atmosphere, or seasonal variations that exceeded their comfort parameters. Humans colonized all 3 worlds within a decade, making only minimal modifications to adapt the environments to their needs rather than the other way around. The galaxy's amusement grew with each impossible human achievement. Surely these newcomers would eventually encounter a challenge they couldn't overcome. They would find their limits and settle into a more reasonable existence like every other species had done. This assumption would prove to be the galaxy's first major miscalculation regarding humanity. The human expansion continued at a pace that defied conventional wisdom about sustainable colonization. Where other species spent years carefully studying potential colony worlds and decades preparing the perfect terraforming solutions, humans simply showed up and started building. They seemed to view hostile environments not as obstacles to be overcome, but as puzzles to be solved. And they approached each puzzle with an enthusiasm that bordered on the incomprehensible. When the methane breathers of Titan 7 offered to sell the humans a world in the Outer Rim that was moderately challenging by their standards, they were confident they had found something that would finally humble these presumptuous newcomers. The world they offered was a nightmare by any reasonable measure. Crushing gravity 3 times galactic standard, an atmosphere of sulfur compounds that corroded most known materials, and geological instability that made permanent structures seemingly impossible to maintain. The humans not only accepted the offer, but paid above the asking price. Within 5 years, New Sulfuria was producing rare earth metals at a rate that made it one of the most profitable mining operations in the sector. The humans had developed new alloys that actually became stronger when exposed to the sulfuric atmosphere. And they had turned the geological instability into an advantage by creating mobile mining platforms that could relocate whenever seismic activity indicated rich new deposits. The methane breathers were so impressed they offered to sell the humans 3 more impossible worlds. Humanity bought them all. By this point, the galaxy's amusement was beginning to shift toward unease. These humans weren't just surviving in impossible conditions, they were prospering in them. More troubling still, they seemed to be getting better at it with each new challenge. What had started as a species-wide quirk was revealing itself to be something more systematic, a fundamental approach to existence that was alien to everything the galaxy understood about survival and prosperity. The unease deepened when human colonies began outperforming established worlds in economic output, technological innovation, and population growth. Worlds that had been written off as resource sinks were becoming powerhouses under human management. Trade routes that had been considered too dangerous for regular traffic were becoming major shipping lanes as human vessels proved capable of navigating hazards that kept other species' ships grounded. The first serious challenges to human expansion came not from hostile environments but from other species who viewed humanity's rapid growth with increasing alarm. The hegemony of Vorth, still smarting from their failures on the worlds humans had successfully colonized, instituted trade barriers designed to slow human economic growth. The Crystalline Collective began spreading rumors about the inherent instability of human colonies, suggesting that their apparent success was unsustainable and would collapse once the humans encountered real challenges. These efforts had little effect. Human colonies continued to thrive, and humanity's reputation as the galaxy's premier specialists in impossible worlds only grew stronger. What's worse, from the perspective of humanity's critics, was that humans seemed genuinely puzzled by the hostility they were encountering. They approached diplomatic disputes with the same problem-solving mentality they brought to hostile environments, viewing opposition not as malice but as another challenge to overcome through persistence and adaptation. This attitude infuriated species that were accustomed to more traditional power dynamics. When the hegemony of Vorth demanded that humans cease their expansion into Vorthian spheres of influence, the human ambassador responded by offering to help the Vorth establish their own colonies on worlds they had previously abandoned. When the Crystalline Collective accused humans of destabilizing established galactic order, the human representative invited them to visit New Sulfuria to see how former wastelands could be transformed into productive worlds. The galaxy was beginning to realize that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their ability to survive hostile environments, it was their inability to comprehend the concept of insurmountable obstacles. Part 2. The Paradise Protocol and the Test of Human Endurance. The idea for what would later be called the Paradise Protocol emerged from a closed session of the Galactic Council's Security Committee in late 2003-94. The committee, composed of representatives from the galaxy's most established powers, had been meeting regularly to discuss what they euphemistically termed the human question. Humanity's continued expansion and success had begun to threaten the established order in ways that simple trade disputes and diplomatic pressure couldn't address. Admiral Krexfor of the hegemony of Vorth was the first to articulate what many were thinking. These humans have never faced true adversity. Their entire expansion has been built on conquering worlds that were already hostile. They've never had to adapt to something genuinely difficult. Genuine paradise. The statement might have sounded paradoxical to anyone unfamiliar with galactic history, but the committee members understood immediately. Paradise worlds, planets with perfect climates, abundant resources, and no significant challenges had been the downfall of more civilizations than any death world had ever claimed. Species that grew soft in perfect conditions inevitably stagnated, their populations becoming complacent and their technological development grinding to a halt. The ethereal consciousness had abandoned 3 paradise worlds over the past millennium, not because of any external threat, but because their populations had simply lost the will to achieve anything beyond basic maintenance of their comfortable existence. The crystalline collective's home system had once included 2 paradise worlds, both now essentially retirement communities for individuals who had given up on progress in favor of eternal leisure. Valnara of the Altrurian Collective, the galaxy's foremost expert on species psychology, outlined the theory that would become the foundation of the Paradise Protocol. Humans derive their strength from adversity. Remove the adversity, provide them with perfect conditions, and they should theoretically undergo the same psychological degradation that has affected every other species when placed in paradise environments. The question is whether we can create conditions perfect enough to trigger this response. The plan that emerged from these discussions was elegant in its simplicity. The galaxy's major powers would offer humanity something unprecedented, a paradise world of their own design. Not just any paradise world, but one tailored specifically to human preferences and needs. Perfect climate, ideal gravity, abundant resources, no natural hazards, no predators, no challenges of any kind. They would present it as a reward for humanity's remarkable achievements, a chance for the species to enjoy the fruits of their labors in perfect comfort. The expectation was that humanity would accept this gift eagerly, establish major colonies on the paradise world, and within a generation or two, succumb to the same complacency that had neutralized so many other potential galactic powers. The humans would become content to enjoy their perfect world. Their expansion would cease, and the established order could continue without disruption. The world chosen for this purpose was designated Kepler 186f in human astronomical catalogues, though the Galactic Council preferred to use the designation Paradise 1. It was, by any objective measure, the most perfect world ever discovered. The planet's gravity was precisely 1 standard galactic unit, comfortable for virtually every known sapient species. Its atmosphere was an ideal mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, with trace gases that created breathable air without any of the reactive dangers of Earth's high oxygen environment. The weather was utterly predictable, gentle rains that fell on schedule, moderate temperatures that varied only within the most comfortable ranges, and complete absence of the violent storms that plagued most worlds. Paradise. One's ecosystem had been carefully engineered over thousands of years by the Gardener civilization, an ancient species that had dedicated themselves to creating perfect worlds before mysteriously vanishing from the galaxy. Every plant was beautiful and harmless, producing abundant fruit and grains that required no cultivation. Every animal was docile and friendly, presenting no threat to colonists. There were no diseases, no venomous creatures, no natural disasters, and no resource scarcities of any kind. The planet's mineral wealth was so abundant and accessible that rare metals could literally be picked up from the surface. Rivers flowed with pure, clean water that required no treatment. The soil was so fertile that almost anything would grow in it without effort. Even the planet's rotation and orbit were perfect, creating an ideal balance of day and night with seasons that were nothing more than gentle variations in an already perfect climate. When the Galactic Council's delegation presented Paradise 1 to humanity as a recognition of their unique achievements and a gesture of friendship from the galaxy's established civilizations, the human representatives were initially suspicious. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, humanity's chief diplomat, asked pointed questions about why such a valuable world was being offered freely and what the Council expected in return. The delegation, led by Chancellor Brixall of the Altrurian Collective, assured her that this was purely a gift, a celebration of humanity's successful integration into galactic civilization and recognition of their remarkable ability to thrive in challenging environments. "We believe," Chancellor Brixall explained, "that a species as capable as yours deserves the opportunity to experience true peace and prosperity. You have proven your strength through adversity. Now let us offer you the chance to enjoy the rewards of that strength. The human delegation asked for time to consider the offer, which the council readily granted. They expected the humans to spend months analyzing paradise, one eventually concluding that it was indeed too good to be true. When those investigations revealed nothing but confirmation of the world's perfection, the humans would surely accept, and the Paradise Protocol would be set in motion. Instead, humanity's response came within weeks and completely blindsided the Council. "We accept your generous gift," Ambassador Vasquez announced at the next Council session, "and we propose to make Paradise, one, a joint colony, open to any species that wishes to participate in this experiment in perfect living." The Council members exchanged glances of confusion and alarm. This wasn't part of the plan. The Paradise Protocol required human isolation on the perfect world, not galactic cooperation in experiencing its effects. Chancellor Brixler attempted to maintain diplomatic composure while steering the conversation back toward the intended outcome. "While we appreciate humanity's generous spirit, we believe this gift should remain specifically human. After all, it was designed as recognition of your unique achievements. That's exactly why we want to share it." Vasquez replied with a smile that somehow managed to be both genuine and unsettling. "If we've learned anything from our expansion across the galaxy, it's that the most interesting challenges come from cooperation with species who think differently than we do. A paradise world shared with multiple species sounds like exactly the kind of complex social and logistical challenge that would keep things interesting." The Council found themselves in an impossible position. Refusing to allow other species to participate would make their motivations obvious and potentially expose the Paradise Protocol. Agreeing would fundamentally alter the experiment and likely prevent the intended outcome. After heated closed-door discussions, they agreed to allow limited participation by other species, hoping that a predominantly human colony would still succumb to Paradise-induced stagnancy. The first human colony ships arrived at Paradise 6 months later, accompanied by smaller delegations from a dozen other species who had volunteered to participate in what the humans enthusiastically described as the galaxy's greatest cooperation experiment. The Council watched nervously as the colonists established their first settlements, waiting for signs that Paradise was having its expected effect. Those signs never came. Within the first month, the human colonists had identified what they called optimization opportunities throughout Paradise One's ecosystem. While other species were content to enjoy the world's abundant fruit and grains, humans began experimenting with selective breeding to create new varieties. They established workshops to craft tools and art from the planet's readily available materials, not because they needed these items for survival, but because, as one colonist explained, "It's interesting to see what we can make." The perfect predictability of Paradise, One's weather became a source of frustration rather than comfort for many human colonists. James Chen, the colony's chief meteorologist, submitted formal requests to the Galactic Council, asking if there were any techniques for introducing a little variety into the planet's atmospheric patterns. "We understand that stable weather has its advantages," he wrote. "Is there any way to add some seasonal storms or pressure variations? Nothing dangerous, just something to make weather monitoring more engaging." By the 6th month, human engineers were proposing modifications to Paradise One's geological structure to create more interesting terrain features. The planet's perfectly flat plains and gently rolling hills were, according to their surveys, aesthetically pleasing but practically boring. They wanted to introduce some variation, perhaps some hills that were actually challenging to climb, or rivers with rapids that would require skill to navigate. The Council's observers reported with growing alarm that rather than becoming complacent, the human colonists seemed to be growing restless. They had established efficient systems for all necessary tasks within weeks of arrival, and were now spending their abundant free time on increasingly complex projects that served no apparent survival purpose. They were building elaborate art installations, organizing competitive games that seemed designed to create artificial challenges, and conducting scientific experiments aimed at understanding and potentially modifying Paradise One's perfect ecosystem. Most disturbing of all, the human population was growing rapidly and showing no signs of the decreased birth rates that typically accompanied Paradise World settlement. Human families seemed as interested in raising children on Paradise One as they had been in the challenging environments of their other colonies, and those children were proving just as energetic and ambitious as their parents. The other species participating in the Paradise One colony were experiencing the expected effects. The Ultrarian delegation had settled into comfortable routines of contemplation and leisure. The crystalline collective representatives spent most of their time in quiet meditation, enjoying the peace and perfect conditions. Even the hardy Krillians had found themselves relaxing for the first time in their species' recorded history, their warrior culture giving way to contentment and ease. Only the humans seemed immune to Paradise's soporific effects, and their restless energy was beginning to influence the other species. Altrurian contemplatives found themselves drawn into human art projects. Crystalline collective meditation was being interrupted by invitations to participate in human optimization experiments. Krillian warriors were rediscovering their competitive spirits through human organized games and challenges. By the end of the first year, Paradise One was not the passive retreat the Council had envisioned, but a thriving hub of innovation and cooperation. The human colonists had established research stations, art academies, and engineering workshops. They had begun sending expeditions to Paradise One's two moons, not for resources or strategic advantage, but because, as expedition leader Captain Sarah Martinez explained, they're there and we're curious about what we might find. The Paradise Protocol was not merely failing. It was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of neutralizing human expansion, it had given humanity access to a perfect staging ground for further development. And instead of isolating them, it had strengthened their relationships with other galactic species who were experiencing human enthusiasm firsthand. Part 3. The Revelation of Human Nature and Galactic Transformation. The failure of the Paradise Protocol forced the Galactic Council to confront a truth that challenged the fundamental assumptions of their civilization. Humanity's strength did not come from their ability to endure adversity, but from their refusal to accept any condition, paradise or purgatory, as permanent or unimprovable. Dr. Zekai's follow-up report on Paradise One provided the first systematic analysis of what made humanity different from every other species the galaxy had encountered. The humans, she wrote, do not distinguish between survival and thriving. For most species, survival is the baseline from which thriving becomes possible. For humans, every moment of existence is an opportunity for improvement, regardless of starting conditions. They do not overcome adversity in order to reach comfort. They transform every condition, comfortable or uncomfortable, into a platform for further achievement. This revelation came to be known as the human paradox. A species that had evolved on a Deathworld had not developed the typical Deathworld mentality of endurance and caution, but had instead developed an approach to existence that treated every environment as both a challenge to master and an opportunity to improve. The implications of this paradox became clear as reports from Paradise One continued to arrive at Council headquarters. The human colonists were not content to enjoy the world's perfection. They were actively working to enhance it. They had introduced controlled weather variations to make agriculture more interesting. They had created artificial geological features to provide recreational challenges. They had even begun experimenting with biological modifications to Paradise One's docile fauna, not to make them dangerous, but to make them more engaging companions for human children. More significantly, the humans were treating Paradise One as a testing ground for new forms of civilization. The abundance of resources and perfect living conditions allowed them to experiment with social structures, economic systems, and technological developments that would have been impossible on resource-limited worlds. They were not using their paradise as a place to rest from their achievements, but as a laboratory for achieving even greater things. The other species participating in the Paradise One colony were being transformed by their exposure to this human approach. Velnara's psychological profiles showed that Altrurians who had spent time working alongside humans were returning to their homeworlds with unprecedented levels of motivation and creativity. Crystalline collective individuals were proposing new technological projects for the first time in centuries. Even the Cryalians were adapting human optimization concepts to their military traditions, developing new training methods that focused on continuous improvement rather than maintenance of existing capabilities. The Paradise Protocol's failure became a public relations disaster for the Council's major powers when human ambassadors began sharing the generous gift they had received with the rest of the galaxy. Ambassador Vasquez's presentations about Paradise One's success included detailed documentation of the cooperation and innovation taking place there, along with open invitations for additional species to participate in what she described as the most successful cooperative venture in galactic history. Species that had been excluded from the original Paradise One colony began demanding explanations. Why had they not been offered the opportunity to participate in this remarkable experiment? what criteria had been used to select the species that were allowed to join. When council members attempted to explain that paradise, one had been intended as a specific gift to humanity, they found themselves having to justify why such a valuable world had been given away, rather than being developed for the benefit of the galaxy as a whole. The situation became untenable when smaller species that had been marginalized by the galaxy's major powers began requesting human assistance in establishing their own colonies on challenging worlds. Humanity's success on Deathworlds and Paradise worlds alike had created a reputation for problem-solving that made them the galaxy's most sought-after partners for difficult colonization projects. The tiny hive minds of Tau Ceti, whose collective consciousness required specific atmospheric conditions to function properly, asked for human help in establishing colonies on worlds with variable atmospheric chemistry. The silicon-based crystal weavers needed assistance with planets that had high electromagnetic interference that disrupted their communication networks. Even the gaseous philosophers who had never successfully established permanent settlements anywhere requested human consultation on adapting to solid matter environments. In each case, human engineers and scientists approached these challenges with the same systematic optimism they had applied to their own colonization efforts. They did not simply solve problems, they found ways to turn problems into advantages. The hive mind's atmospheric requirements led to the development of adaptive atmospheric processes that could adjust planetary conditions in real time. The crystal weavers' electromagnetic difficulties resulted in new forms of communication technology that actually worked better in high-interference environments. The gaseous philosophers' struggle with solid matter worlds led to the creation of hybrid environments that allowed gas-based consciousness to interact with solid-based technology in unprecedented ways. These successes further undermined the authority of the galaxy's traditional powers. Species that had been dependent on the major civilizations for technological advancement and colonization support were finding that humans could provide better solutions with fewer restrictions and more genuine cooperation. The hegemony of Vorth watched their client species defect to human-supported independence movements. The crystalline collective saw their technological monopolies broken by human innovations that made advanced systems accessible to species that had previously been excluded from such developments. The ethereal consciousness lost influence as their philosophy of careful, gradual progress was overshadowed by human demonstrations that rapid, dramatic change could be both safe and beneficial. The Council's response was to propose formal limitations on human expansion and cooperation with other species. Resolution 2397. Omega called for regulated development protocols that would require pre-approval from the Council before any species could establish colonies on worlds classified above Class 6 on the Deathworld scale. It also established cooperative development guidelines that would place Council oversight on any multi-species colonization projects. Humanity's response was to formally invite every species in the galaxy to a conference on Paradise, one to discuss cooperative alternatives to regulated development. The invitation was not just a diplomatic challenge, it was a fundamental rejection of the galaxy's power structure. The Paradise Conference, as it came to be known, was attended by representatives from over 300 species, including many that had never before been invited to participate in galactic governance. The conference lasted for 3 standard months and resulted in the Declaration of Cooperative Development, a document that established principles for galactic expansion that were diametrically opposed to the Council's centralized control model. The declaration proposed that any species should be free to attempt colonization of any world, provided they were willing to accept the risks and responsibilities involved. It established protocols for interspecies cooperation that prioritized mutual benefit over hierarchical authority. Most importantly, it created the Galactic Cooperation Network, a decentralized system for sharing resources, technology, and expertise that bypassed the Council's traditional control mechanisms entirely from there. The signing of the declaration was accompanied by announcements of dozens of new cooperation agreements between previously unconnected species, most of them involving human technical assistance or participation. The galaxy's political landscape was transformed almost overnight from a hierarchical system controlled by a few major powers to a network of cooperative relationships centered around shared challenges and mutual improvement. The major powers faced a choice: adapt to the new paradigm, or find themselves increasingly irrelevant to galactic development. The hegemony of Vorth chose adaptation, announcing new policies that emphasized cooperation over domination, and beginning their own difficult world colonization projects in partnership with species they had previously considered subjects. The Crystalline Collective opened their technological archives to general access and began collaborating with human engineers on projects that combined their advanced theoretical knowledge with human practical problem-solving approaches. The ethereal consciousness struggled more with adaptation, as their fundamental philosophy was challenged by the human approach to existence. Their belief in gradual, careful progress seemed not just cautious but actively limiting when compared to human achievements. However, even they began to explore new possibilities when human philosophers proposed that rapid change and careful thought were not necessarily incompatible, that one could embrace dramatic transformation while maintaining philosophical rigor. Dr. Valnara's final report on the Paradise Protocol included an observation that would become the defining insight of the new galactic age. We sought to neutralize humanity by giving them paradise and removing all challenges from their existence. We failed to understand that for humans, the absence of external challenges simply creates the opportunity to pursue internal ones. They do not survive adversity and then rest. They transform whatever conditions they encounter into platforms for further growth. This is not a response to their Deathworld origins, but a fundamental aspect of their consciousness that would manifest in any environment. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This ancient human wisdom had proven true on a galactic scale. Humanity's strength lay not in their ability to endure hardship, but in their refusal to accept any version of themselves as final or complete. Whether facing the crushing gravity of a death world or the perfect comfort of paradise, they approached each condition as a starting point rather than a destination. The galaxy had laughed at the death world scale, assuming that any species tough enough to survive such conditions would eventually reach their limits and settle into comfortable stagnation like every other civilization. They had failed to recognize that the death world had not made humans hard. It had made them adaptable, and adaptability, once developed, could not be turned off by changing conditions. The Paradise Protocol's failure marked the end of the old galactic order and the beginning of a new age of cooperation and continuous improvement. Species that had stagnated for millennia under the benevolent domination of the major powers found themselves energized by contact with human approaches to problem-solving and existence. Worlds that had been written off as uninhabitable became thriving colonies. Technologies that had been monopolized by advanced civilizations became tools for general development. The humans, for their part, seemed genuinely surprised by the transformation they had catalyzed. They had not set out to revolutionize galactic civilization. They had simply approached each challenge and opportunity with their characteristic combination of optimism, persistence, and refusal to accept limitations as permanent. The fact that this approach proved revolutionary was, from their perspective, less important than the fact that it was effective. Ambassador Vasquez's closing address to the Paradise Conference captured the essence of humanity's contribution to galactic civilization. We didn't come to the galaxy to teach anyone anything or to prove any points about our superiority. We came because we're curious about what's out here and what we might be able to accomplish together. If our approach to challenges has been helpful to others, that's wonderful. But it's not because we're special or unique. It's because we've learned that every condition, whether it's a death world or a paradise, is just a starting point. What matters is not where you start, but what you choose to do with where you are. The galaxy that had once laughed at the death world scale now understood that the scale itself was based on a flawed assumption. It measured a world's hostility to existing life, but it could not measure a world's potential for fostering the growth of life that refused to accept limitations. The humans had not conquered the galaxy's most challenging worlds by being stronger than the challenges. They had succeeded by treating the challenges as opportunities to become stronger themselves. In the end, the Paradise Protocol had taught the galaxy its most important lesson. True strength comes not from the ability to endure adversity or enjoy comfort, but from the refusal to allow any external condition to define the limits of what is possible. The man who destroys his weak self, who refuses to accept any version of himself as final, can indeed never be destroyed by others because destruction requires the acceptance of limitations that such a person simply does not recognize. The galaxy would never again underestimate the species from the little death world at the edge of the Orion Arm. But more importantly, it would never again underestimate what any species might accomplish once they learned to approach existence with the same relentless optimism and adaptability that humanity had brought to every world they encountered. The age of fixed limitations was over. The age of continuous possibility had begun. End of document. Final word. Count. Approximately 8,000 words.